Scuttle.
My lady, may I please call Lucy Fraser Casey?
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming along to help us, Ms Fraser.
No, my pleasure.
Can you please state your full name?
Lucy Claire Fraser.
Ms. Fraser, thank you for providing a helpful witness statement to the inquiry. You should have it in front of you, and it's INQ 000588042 for the inquiry's reference. Before I begin with my questions about the children and a young person's secure estate, I'd like to just go through your professional background first. You were elected as a Member of Parliament for South East Cambridgeshire in 2015, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And you served as an MP until 2024.
I did.
From July of 2019 until March of 2021, you were a Minister of State at the Ministry of Justice.
Yep.
The Ministry of Justice at that point was led by the Secretary of State for Justice, who's also the Lord Chancellor, and who was at that point the Right Honourable Sir Robert Buckland,
Yes.
King's Counsel. Your ministerial portfolio was prisons and probation.
Yes.
Is that right? And you assisted the Lord Chancellor in his duties. He was accountable to Parliament for Her Majesty's Prison and Probation Service.
That's right.
Is that right? Which we'll refer to as HMPPS. He was also accountable to Parliament for the policy of HMPPS and oversight,
Yes,
and you supported him in that role.
that's correct.
Okay. You set out in your witness statement that your role was to support the Lord Chancellor in the decision and framework around the lockdown of prisons and the lifting of restrictions as the pandemic progressed. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I was sought in my witness. I was responsible to support him in his roles so far as it related to my portfolio. And I tried in my witness statement to pick out the key things. So that was one of the key things.
Yes, so you supported him insofar as his role touched on your portfolio of prisons and probation.
Exactly.
Okay. And I think you also say in your statement that in the first months of the pandemic, you were more involved than usual in operational matters in prisons. Is that right?
Yes, in broad terms. I also say in my statement that I was not responsible for the operations of this state. That was the responsibility of HMPPS. But inevitably over this period, I had a much closer relationship with HMPPS than I had done previously.
Yes. And sorry, I think the transcript, it says in operations of the state. Do you mean the
Estate.
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 Yes.
Estate.
Yes,
The
that's
prison
right.
estate
Yes.
might be a better way of putting it.
So HMPPS was responsible for the day-to-day running of the
Exactly.
prison's estate.
Yeah,
You and ultimately the Lord Chancellor had oversight over it.
correct.
But in the immediate months after the pandemic, you had more involvement than usual because it was an exceptional time, I suppose.
Yes, but during the course of the pandemic, at the beginning, I had a one-to-one daily meeting with the CEO of HMPPS, which was not what I had done prior to that.
No. Okay. And finally, just on the question of your role, you also ensured that appropriate legislation was in place to respond to the pandemic. And for example, you laid several statutory instruments before Parliament to facilitate, for example, the early release of prisoners and changes to the prison regime.
That's correct.
And we'll go on to talk about those in detail later on. But before we get in to the substance, I'd like to ask you, your responsibilities were, of course, not limited to the secure estate as regards children. Your responsibilities extended to the adult estate as well.
That's correct.
And at the time of the pandemic, there were roughly 800 children in custody in England and Wales.
That's right.
And the adult estate had roughly 80,000 adults.
That's correct.
So children made up roughly 1% of the entire population of detainees that you had responsibility for.
That's statistically correct.
Okay. There are three types of institutions that hold children in England and Wales. There are youth offender institutes, is that right? Institutions,
Yeah,
rather?
yeah.
And they're for offenders aged 15 to 21. They're larger sites and have lower staff-to-child ratios, have higher child-to-staff ratios than secure training centres and secure children's
Just
homes.
repeat that.
Sorry. They hold children 15 to 21. They're
Yeah.
larger sites.
Yeah.
And of the three, there are fewer staff per child.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, okay. And secure training centres hold children under the age of 15 who've been sentenced to a detention and training order. Is
That's
that right?
correct.
Okay. And during the specified period, there were two in operation. Oak Hill Secure Training Centre and Rainsbrook Secure Training
Yes,
Centre.
that's right.
Okay. Secure children's homes are smaller sites still, and they're designed to accommodate children and young people between the ages of 10 and 17. They can accommodate children on welfare or justice grounds, and they're operated by local authorities.
Correct.
Okay. So now that we have a picture of the secure estate,
Could I add to that? Because when you said the adult estate, I would distinguish between the adult male estate and the adult female estate. And there were distinctions between the adult male estate, the female estate, and the youth estate, and I was responsible for all of those.
I see. So you would draw sort of three groups,
I would draw three groups with distinct needs,
distinct needs.
that we needed to consider differently, generally and throughout the pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Before we consider the impact of the pandemic on the youth estate, which is, of course, what this module of the inquiry is focused on, I'd like to take a brief snapshot of the sort of state of children's prisons on the eve of the pandemic, looking in particular at time out of cell and education. And to do that, I'd like to bring up the inspectorate report from 2019 to 2020. This is the annual report. It was actually published in November, so after the pandemic and the restrictions had come to pass. But it gives us a picture of what the prisons were like just on the eve of the pandemic. So if we can turn, please, to page 9. Yes, this is just in definitions, which I think is helpful. The inspectorate defines solitary confinement as when detainees are confined alone for 22 hours or more a day without meaningful human contact. And then if we can scroll down, please, to page 72. This is the chapter focused on children and looking at the report on time out of cell. It says, while children had reasonably good time out of cell on weekdays at Park and Warrington, these are youth offender institutions, elsewhere they simply did not have enough time outside of their cell. In many cases, including time for education to access everyday basics, including association, showers, and telephone calls. At Feltham A, children were unlocked for only 4.2 hours on a weekday and much less at the weekends. And at the weekends, the experience of children was poor across the estate. Only 27% said they spent more than 2 hours out of their cell on a Saturday or Sunday. And that 2 hours is an important distinction because less than 2 hours is tipping into solitary confinement territory. It also says time spent in the open air was also not good enough. More than half of children said they did not get daily access to exercise outdoors. The continued inability of many sites to provide children with enough time out of cell to access sufficient education, exercise, and meaningful human contact with others significantly affected outcomes across all areas. And if we can just turn, please, to this next page. page 73, which is considering education. So the table 12 is reflects Ofsted assessments in education, and it shows that none of the institutions were outstanding. A little under half were good, but more than half were requires improvement or inadequate. Would you accept that this inspection report shows that there were significant problems in the management of prisons for children, and particularly in respect of their time out of cell and the education standards that prevailed?
Yes, I accept that there have been some assessments of the estate, of the youth estate, and many of the institutions should have been operating better on a number of levels. I should say that you mentioned the work that I was doing during my time as Prisons Minister. And obviously in this period, a lot of it was spent dealing with the pandemic. But it wasn't the only thing that I dealt with during the pandemic. And one of the things that I was looking at over this period, whilst I was Prisons Minister, was how should we treat young people in prisons? And one of the things that we were doing as a policy matter was moving from YOIs to secure schools, so away from a prison system and into an institution that offered education as its core, where children were still in a secure environment. And we did manage to train the process to set one of those up. And that was what we were trying to do, to move away from this type of system into a new system. But
I see. And so the objective, if I've understood correctly, is to move away from youth offender institutions, for example, which are prisons, towards a secure school system. I think we've heard evidence already in the inquiry about, I think, the Oasis group setting up.
Exactly. So that was the one that was going to be our first secure school, run by what is essentially an academy trust.
Yes. And so can I take from that there's an understanding that the secure estate wasn't operating as it should, and that it was therefore necessary to move away from prisons for children towards a different model?
I think those are two distinct issues. One is the estate, as shown by this, could have been operating better. And secondly, what is the right policy proposal for children who have offended?
Okay. Moving on then from the period before the pandemic, and I should just, for the sake of completeness, you were aware of the issues in the estate before the pandemic arose.
Yes, and it's not confined to the youth estate.
Okay. So then if we move on now to the response to the pandemic and the lockdown of prisons in March of 2020. In your witness statement, you address your evolving understanding of the pandemic and the steps taken by the Ministry of Justice to ensure readiness for the impact of the pandemic on prisons. And initially, the plan was to operate normal regimes for as long as possible, in line with advice from PHE. And I think we have here a public statement made by you on the 12th of March. Yes, it's INQ 000611331. If we can scroll, please, to, yes, page 2. This is a public statement made by you. And the last bullet point is, we understand that prisoners and their loved ones might be concerned about the situation, but we can assure them that we will continue to operate normal regimes with the minimum disruption for as long as we can. Do you remember
that was
statement?
the feeling by us as ministers, by HMPPS, and was the advice of our expert, Dr. O'Moore.
Yes. And was that because a sort of normal regime, if we're focusing on children for the time being, that a normal regime for children would be better for them that they would be able to have activities outside of their cells, that they could have access to education visits.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so the intention was to keep that running as long as possible.
Well, actually, it wasn't just because of the. I mean, we know that you get better rehabilitation if you have purposeful activity. You have better well-being if you are occupied and engage with human contact. You get better outcomes if you get education. So those are the advantages of continuing a normal regime. But also, we also have to think about prison disruption and riots, and obviously the more content the children were, the easier it is for staff as well, and the more obviously the environment is better for everybody who works there.
At a certain point, the plan changed away from operating a normal regime for as long as possible to implementing a national lockdown. If I can take you to your witness statement now, paragraphs 94 and 95, where you deal with that. You say, on the 23rd of March, the Lord Chancellor attended the COBRA meeting at 5 o'clock. Shortly before the meeting, the Cabinet Office circulated a paper on social distancing, temporary additional measures. Actions and decisions from the COBRA meeting were circulated at just after 7, and the Prime Minister announced a national lockdown in a television broadcast at 8:30. I think almost all of us remember that televised broadcast. And then at paragraph 95, given the decision had been made and publicly communicated, it was our role and immediate priority for the Ministry of Justice to implement the national lockdown across its business areas, including the prison estate. On the 24th of March, my private secretary emailed me at 7 o'clock in the morning and said, as mentioned last night, the team is working on what the PM's announcement yesterday means for prisons and probation. Can I take it from your statement that it was at the point of that public announcement by the Prime Minister that the plan for prisons had changed and that you would therefore pursue a sort of national lockdown?
So can I give you a little bit of context? Because you're factually accurate, but I don't think it exactly explains what was happening in prisons at that time.
Please.
So we were in the position, we wanted to continue a regime as normal as possible. But by that time, the regime was not normal. So we had a pandemic within our prisons. We had staff going sick. We had prisoners getting sick. And we had arrangements within prisons already, as advised by PHE, as to how we should deal with separating people according to whether they were showing symptoms or not, and also when they were coming new into the prison. I think we were operating at that time at 50% operational capacity. We were always very concerned about losing staff and not being able to operate our prisons effectively. So by the time of the national lockdown, HMPPS had prepared guidance, which you might be taking me to, but at this stage, we had guidance which could be put in place if we had to go to a system that where a particular prison was so infected that it could not operate as it usually was and had to be severely restricted in its operations. So you're right to say that we implemented a national lockdown because the Prime Minister announced a national lockdown, and we had to implement that and follow what he had stated. But there was a transitional period between a normal regime and where we were.
Yes, I see. Well, I don't think I need to take you to the guidance, but it's certainly right that there had been guidance circulated by HMPPS to prisons explaining, as you say, that they might have to have a more restricted regime if they were unable to meet minimum staffing levels. I think MSL, it's called.
Yes,
guidance. Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And so the position was that if they were unable to operate a
Exactly.
normal regime, they would have to have a severely
Yeah.
restricted one. But it wasn't envisaged until the announcement that whatever the staffing levels, there was going to be a lockdown of all prisons.
No, what we were preparing for was that we thought it was likely that individual prisons would go into a lockdown scenario because that was required from a health perspective. But on the when the Prime Minister made his announcement, it became clear that we had to go to a national lockdown across the estate.
Okay. Then moving on to the 24th of March, so the day after the announcement, you describe the decision-making in your statement here at paragraph 96. So you say the Lord Chancellor and officials met on the morning of the 24th. I can't remember this meeting, and the readout I have seen does not state who attended or provide details of the discussion. But the Lord Chancellor would have been the decision-maker. I'm sure that we would have been advised by HMPPS following their overnight reflections that as a result of the Prime Minister's decision to introduce the first national lockdown, we needed to move to full lockdown. We would have also considered all the factors which we were already aware of and had sought advice on, including the risk of transmission within the confined custodial state and the operational considerations. It was recognized by everyone that we needed to mirror the impacts on the community within prisons. What I want to ask you about is this idea of mirroring the impacts on the community within prisons. If we're considering just children for the moment, there are significant differences between a lockdown in the community for children and a lockdown in prisons. So, for example, children in the community at this stage were, in the main, required to stay in their own homes with their families. That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, can I give a bit of you're right, and that is what I say, and it is one of the considerations. But
Yeah.
would you mind if I set out what we were considering? Because I don't know whether it comes across sufficiently in terms of the decision making that we had, that we were making, and the factors we were considering at that
Please.
time. Before I go on to
Yes.
address your question about
Yes.
the mirroring of the community. So, at this stage, we were advised by our expert, with whom, who had been advising us for a long time, and whose instincts we shared. So if you remember, PHE had advised that we should be open up for as long as possible. So in that context, the advice that we needed to lock down and the consequences of lockdown, we trusted, because our instinct and his instinct initially had been the same. So he advised that if we did nothing, we were looking at 2,500 to 3,500 people dying in prisons, which, as you can imagine as a minister, you take extremely seriously that might happen on your watch and your responsibility. We were also really worried about staff. So in our preparations that we were doing for this, as you said, the minimum service levels, mainly we were thinking about what do we do if we don't have enough staff to run the prisons? And that was our main issue, because that was the biggest threat. Now, if people were dying in prisons and catching COVID and giving it to staff, the staff not only would suffer, and we had a duty of care to staff, but also they wouldn't be able to come in and service the prison. That meant we possibly wouldn't be able to even provide the basic level of care. We wouldn't be able to feed people. We wouldn't be able to open up for their showers and take them to the toilet. So we were really worried about whether we were going to have staff that were coming in at all. And would they refuse to come in? They were all scared. They were at home. And would they just not come in? Some of them had caring responsibilities. Some of them had illnesses that meant that they might have been significantly affected. So those two factors, we were responsible for people potentially dying, and we were responsible for making sure duty to our staff and that they came into service prisons were foremost in our mind at the time.
I see.
But also, we were worried about riots. We were worried not just about riots because of our own obligations to the prisons and looking after young people. But if we had a riot in a prison at a time when we were trying to keep the public calm and have a sense that the government was in control of coronavirus, that wasn't going to really reflect well on the government and therefore the country as a whole. So we had all these wide considerations to take into account. I'm sure we'll come on to how did we think about children within that context.
Yes.
But many of those, obviously the deaths would have been less significant in the youth estate. But the other factors were exactly the same. Would we have staff to come in to look after it? Would there be a riot in the youth estate?
Yes.
So those were the key factors that we were thinking about. So yes, we did also think about we needed to mirror the community. We needed to think about how did the direction that the Prime Minister make actually literally apply in prisons. And what we were advised was that a household was a cell, not a wing and not a prison. And so we had to implement all of that. And at the same time, we thought it was reasonable to think about the restrictions in the community and implementing them in prisons, not only so we would be doing the right thing as a matter of law and following the policy, but so that people would understand what we were doing and we could communicate it in that way.
I see. We will come on to discuss in due course the deaths in the prison and the advice about that, and also about minimum staffing levels. But if we can just, for the time being, focus on the mirroring in the community, because that's at least one of the reasons. Yeah. So would you agree with me, therefore, that children in the community, that there are important differences, that they were required to stay in their own homes with their families, so not separated from their parents or carers?
I think we asked HMPPS, what did it mean? And they said a cell was equivalent to a household. So that was our starting point. I think it's very difficult. I mean, I can answer your questions clinically if you like.
Yes.
But I think it's very difficult to do an exact comparison of what do we mean in the community and what do we mean
I mean,
in
I
the
think that's
prison.
the point I'm trying to make. You were talking about the importance of mirroring conditions, so drawing a sort of comparison there.
Well, people weren't, to what I mean by mirroring conditions is, we were all at home, all of us, I was at home, my kids were at home, school was restricted, you weren't allowed to go outside much, you're restricted to how much you went outside, you weren't allowed to go to the gym, people weren't allowed to come to your house. So those were the sort of broad levels of community restrictions which were applying to everybody across the country, and those were the sort of things we were thinking we needed to do in prisons.
But children in custody weren't in their homes with their parents. They were alone in a cell, separated from their caregivers, and not allowed to have visits. So it's quite a big distinction, wouldn't you agree?
So I went into politics because I care deeply about young people and wanted to make sure that all young people have opportunities. And I think that we did very carefully think about how did this affect the youth estate. We restricted social visits because nobody was allowed social visits from their families. And I don't think any parents would have come in any event. But you're right. I mean, if you're asking me, were children in prison particularly affected? Was it very difficult for children in prison at this time? Of course it was very difficult for children in prison. They were isolated. They were without their families. It was difficult for them whether they were in lockdown or not, and it was exacerbated by lockdown, yes. If that's what you're asking me, absolutely, yes.
Yes, and that unlike children in the community, vulnerable children who were in the community were able to attend school. Children in prison, on the whole, were vulnerable. More than half of the children in custody were care experienced. They couldn't attend school. So the question is, if I can just put it this way, is you've referred to mirroring conditions in the community as a reason for imposing this national lockdown. But my point is that there was no mirroring. The conditions for children in custody were, in fact, a lot more severe and a lot worse than children in the community.
So I think mirroring the provisions in the community were one of a number of factors, of which was probably the least important. The most important was that we were stopping people dying on our watch, and that we wanted staff to come into prisons, and we didn't want riots across our estate. So those were the most important factors, and the prisons were a vector for illness. So it was, if you were in, we knew that if you were in a closed environment, it was more likely you were going to suffer from getting coronavirus. So those were the overarching factors that we considered when we made our decisions. But we needed to lock down. We were told we needed to lock down, so we did. Do you want me to address the education point?
We'll come on to that in a moment. But I think, firstly,
because I would say to you that we did try and we did provide for education to continue in the youth estate.
Ms. Fraser, we will get to.
Very happy to do
There's an order that we're trying to proceed
Sure.
through. I'd like to deal now just with the advice about the risk of deaths. So this is the advice of Eamon O'Moore. If we could pull that up now, it's INQ 000591144. So this is advice from Eamon O'Moore dated the 24th of March of 2020, so the day after the Prime Minister's announcement. It's a briefing paper, prison population management considerations in response to COVID. The summary is that, I think as you alluded to, prisons are high-risk settings for large outbreaks of COVID. Many people in prison are clinically vulnerable. Risks include excess death rates, need for specialist NHS care. Single-cell accommodation has distinct advantages in supporting protective isolation of vulnerable prisoners. And if we scroll down the page, please, we have this figure that you've mentioned in the penultimate line. HMPPS modelling undertaken with PHE has indicated the possibility of high numbers of deaths in custody and suggests in the region of 10 times the number that we would normally see, with 2,500 to 3,500 based on the reasonable worst case scenario. Potentially half of these deaths may occur over 3 weeks at the height of the outbreak. Is this the briefing from Dr. O'Moore that you recall receiving in the early stages of the pandemic?
Yeah.
Okay. This briefing doesn't mention children and young people, and many of the factors which the advice is based on wouldn't apply. So, for example, children are not older. Obviously, they're children. And if we just zoom in to the background section. So Dr. O'Moore says that prisons are epicenters of infectious disease because of a higher background prevalence of infection, higher levels of risk factors, the unavoidable close contact, and often overcrowded and poorly ventilated unsanitary facilities. So children's prisons were not overcrowded, we know that. Furthermore, all children's prisons have single-cell accommodation. And children's prisons don't concentrate individuals who are susceptible to infection and those with a higher risk of complications. Quite the opposite. Children's prisons would concentrate individuals who weren't at a higher risk. So this advice, though startling and pointing out high numbers of deaths that could occur, is really only appropriate to the adult estate and not to the children's estate.
So this particular advice is mainly about releases, which we will come on to.
Yes.
But the fact that we were going to see, the fact that there was a high risk, let's just take a step back. We all knew that the ship that had, I think it was in Japan.
Diamond Princess?
Yes, the Diamond Princess.
Yeah.
The contagion had spread throughout the prison at a significant rate. We all knew that, whether we had expert evidence or not. Now, if we had, you're right to say, and the advice is right to identify, that the people who were most at risk were people who were seriously ill and who were older. So, of course, the risk was higher for those in the adult estate, and particularly where there were elderly. But that didn't mean that the children were not at any risk at all. And if we'd seen one child die on our watch, that would have been a significant issue for us as ministers. So, of course, the risk was lower, but it wasn't nil. But in addition to that, if the kids had got sick and infected the staff, A, the staff might not have been able to go into work, wouldn't have been able to provide basic care. B, they might have overwhelmed the NHS facilities in the local community. If we had a situation where we had a huge number of people who were sick, although not about to die. So, yes, of course, it was stronger, and the risk was higher in the adult estate, and particularly in some prisons where we had sex offenders who were older. But there was risk everywhere, and we were responsible as ministers for that risk.
Okay.
So we needed to take this advice and the advice that we were given more broadly about what we knew about. I remember we only knew that later that COVID wasn't as serious as we thought it was. So at this stage, we've been told very recently that we could see thousands of people dying on our watch, and that we might have a staff situation that is overwhelming. So those are the factors that we took into account. Plus, we have a national lockdown situation where we've been basically ordered to lock down. Those are the factors that we take into account at the time.
The inquiries reviewed the advice provided by Public Health England to the MOJ and cannot find any that relates to the specific needs and vulnerabilities of children until November of 2020, when advice was given concerning the new restrictions which were brought in force at that time. Can you help us? Was a decision taken not to commission a similar piece of advice for children in March 2020, or was it simply overlooked?
Of course, there wasn't a decision not to provide advice. So Eamon O'Moore, who was our expert, in whom we all had a huge amount of faith, and whose instincts we agreed with, was advising, as far as I was aware, HMPPS on a regular basis. Every single time we had a virus in a particular prison, Eamon O'Moore went into that prison, or I don't know how he did it, but he advised specifically on what arrangements ought to be adopted in that particular prison. So he was responsible for advising on the estate as a whole, which included the youth estate and the female estate. And we did have some infections in the youth estate.
Yes.
We also had discretion in the rules.
We'll come on to the rules and the guidance.
But I think you're suggesting that we didn't take into account of children. We had an expert, and I would refute that. We had an expert who was advised, who was specifically there to advise us on our entire estate. He didn't say to us, by the way, do something totally different. In the children's estate, and I suggest we do this, and we all followed it. We followed his advice as to what he gave us to do across the estate, and he went into institutions and advised on an institution-by-institution basis, and we followed his advice.
Okay. But what I would suggest to you is that he was focused on the adult estate, which was 99% of the prisoners with which he was concerned
And that's why I said we didn't, that's why I corrected you. We had 3 different types of estate. They were all important to us. We took specific individual decisions in relation to pregnant women who were very few in number because they were important. We tried, and we're sure we'll come on to it, to ensure that the youth estate was treated differently with human contact and education. So of course, it took us a huge amount of time, and there were more incidents across the estate. There were more outbreaks in the adult male estate. There were more issues to deal with. But as I've looked back over my papers, I see peppered throughout it references to the youth estate.
Yes.
And in fact, at one stage, I see a note where my private office is
Ms.
recording
Fraser, I'm
the meeting.
sorry to stop you, but there are some questions that I need to ask.
Very happy to answer your questions.
Yeah. So if I could just put the question, what I would suggest to you with respect to the advice from PHE England is that advice which we saw was focused on adults at that stage in the pandemic in March, and he didn't provide advice specific to children, and you didn't ask for advice specific to children. And in that way, in the haste of a national lockdown, which wasn't planned for, the needs and specific vulnerabilities of children were overlooked.
I don't accept that. I think if he had wanted to advise on doing something very different in the youth estate, we would have taken that advice, and we certainly didn't instruct him not to advise us on particular parts of the estate. And we had regular meetings with him and asked him questions. And we did provide, and I look forward to coming on to it, for different rules in relation to the youth estate.
Yeah. Well, let's move on now to the impact of the national lockdown on the youth estate. If I can begin with the guidance that was put in force first on the 24th of March. So if we could bring that up, please. It's INQ 000 530 765. And if we just look at, so this is COVID-19 operational guidance, temporary regime to reduce risk. If we just go to page 3, it sets the background. On the 23rd of March, the government announced new rules on staying at home. That was the Prime Minister's announcement. And it says at the bottom there, in prisons, this means that people in prison will spend more time in their cells. They will, however, be given access to essential services, including meals, showers, telephone contact with loved ones and legal advisors, access to health services, and where possible, time in open air. And it also says all non-essential activities involving groups of people should be stopped. This includes social visits, education, non-essential work, association, communal dining, periods of mass prisoner movement, religious services, and access to the gymnasium. And on page 7, we come to the Youth Custody Service. It says the Youth Custody Service will operate under the same temporary guiding principles as the rest of the adult estate when it comes to carrying out the government's instructions on social distancing. All non-essential activities and activities involving large groups of people or a mass movement of young people have been ceased. Children would have access to telephones in their rooms and would be given extra credit to keep in touch with their families. Children in custody are recognized as a particularly vulnerable group, and additional safeguards should be considered by governors and directors of STCs where necessary. Human contact is especially important for children, and this should be provided where possible and practicable via teachers, key workers, youth workers, etc., while still adhering to strict principles of social distancing. Provision of additional in-room activities and education should be considered and routinely provided. So this is the guidance which came into force straight away.
Yeah.
It is not entirely clear whether education for children would continue or not. I would say the beginning says that there'll be no education. And then when you go on to the section dealing with children, it says human contact is important. And there's an ambiguity. It seems in the last sentence you might have education in rooms, I suppose. But there wasn't a clear statement in this guidance to say that children should still have face-to-face education in their classrooms. That's right, isn't it?
Well, you can read what it says.
Yeah.
I would say you're sort of looking at it as a lawyer after the event, when things were developing at massive pace. And what I see when I read this document, and I think back and I reflect on what I felt at the time as evidenced by the documents, is that there was a shared understanding at a ministerial level, which was reflected at an HMPPS leadership level, that education should be provided for young people. So that's what I discussed in the meeting that I had the afternoon after the decision was made. I was told by Helga and Dr. Farah that education would be provided. We can go through all the, all the incidents and the evidence, but the view I had at the time was that education would be provided. It would not be provided in the same way, potentially in a classroom setting, but in small groups. But it was the clear intention of the management and the ministers at the time that education would be provided in the youth estate and would not be provided in the adult estate.
Okay. And when you say not in the normal way, in small groups, so face-to-face, not in the room, but in smaller groups, so you could comply with social distancing? Is that
So
what you
I'm
had in mind?
I'm not in charge of operations or indeed how it plays out. My understanding at the time was that education would be provided in some way. As far as the guidance gave the institutions discretion, which was necessary, and they were all required to do their own plans. And as a minister, I asked to see a plan because I wanted to make sure that each institution was doing their own plan. And each institution should have been able to think, what can we provide in terms of education and human contact within the confines of a pandemic?
Okay.
And that's what they should have been doing on an institution by institution basis, working with the providers, their staff, and the children.
Yes, Ms. Fraser, I just wanted to check with you. You said that there was a common understanding, and I just
Yes.
want to explore whether that understanding was that education would be, worksheets pushed under the door, or would it be, well, not in a classroom.
No,
I think you said it wouldn't be that.
I understood it was some form of face-to-face education, not worksheets. I mean, worksheets were definitely discussed, and I knew worksheets were happening. I knew things were being pushed through doors, and that was the bare minimum that I was hoping or expecting would happen. But my understanding was that at the outset, each institution should be considering and providing education.
Okay. Well, if we can move to your witness statement, paragraph 203. So that's reference 588042. This is the part of your statement where you discuss expectations around education. And yes, so just prior to that, sorry, if you can scroll up the page, pardon me. Yes, so on the 24th of March, the Children's Commissioner wrote to you raising concerns. And you wanted to highlight the position on education within the youth estate. This is one of the main areas of difference for children as opposed to adults. And it was our clear position that education should continue, and this was resisted by the providers. And you refer to correspondence between the Youth Custody Service and the providers. On the 24th of March, the managing director of Novus, a contracted education provider, sent a notification to all Novus staff saying all non-essential activities involving groups of people should be stopped. This includes social visits, education, non-essential work, association, communal dining, and access to the gymnasium. This was forwarded to the Youth Custody Service. So that was their understanding that there would be no education. And then if we scroll down, please, to paragraph 203. The Youth Custody Service replied to the education provider saying, "We fully accept that classroom-based education needs to cease," and indeed has. And that's in line with your sort of understanding. Is that right, that the classroom-based education would cease? But given the particular vulnerabilities of the children in our care and the importance of some human contact and structure, we are exploring what on-unit outreach type activities can be provided while strictly adhering to social distancing requirements placed on all of us. Does that accord with your understanding at the time that there would be an exploration of on-unit outreach type activities?
Well, I'd continue the sentence whilst strictly adhering to social distancing requirements.
Yeah.
And I'd emphasise the word human contact. I mean, I don't even know whether I saw this letter at the time, but my understanding was that each institution, I don't think you can sort of read particular words and therefore deduce a particular.
I'm just trying to understand.
So
the
my
sort of
understanding is that there would be, they're talking about adhering to social distancing requirements. Mm-hmm. That to me envisages a situation wherein you're in the room with somebody else.
I see.
Getting some sort of provision.
Okay.
It refers to human contact, which to me envisages you're in the room with another human. So my understanding at the time, and as you said, I'm dealing with a large estate and the youth estate and policy considerations and a load of other issues. But my overall understanding at the time was that we wanted to provide education of some kind and that was Dr. Farah's clear position in all my conversations with her. And that didn't happen, as we later see, and we can go on to the reasons why that didn't happen, but we were intending to provide human contact through education.
Okay. Well, the guidance in place at the time and the guidance...
Just correct myself, it did happen in Park.
That's
and
right.
it did potentially happen in some other places as
Yes. But the guidance in place at the time, and it was amended from time to time, until we got to the national framework for coming out of lockdowns. None of the guidance ever said in terms that children should have face-to-face education. And what I'm trying to explore with you is whether that was a miscommunication between you and HMPPS, or was it a resistance from HMPPS to do that?
I don't know why the guidance didn't explicitly say it, but it did imply it at a minimum. I think it did more than that. It said human contact was necessary and education should be considered. And it was my understanding that that's what HMPPS was trying to provide.
We have heard evidence from Charlie Taylor.
Could you just repeat your questions, because I'm not sure I answered your particular questions. I'm happy to if you want me to.
No, I think you have
Okay.
answered. I think, thank you. We've heard evidence from Charlie Taylor from Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons already, that face-to-face education did continue at YOI Park, as you mentioned. His evidence was that HMPPS prevented education from taking place. And I'd like to take you to the transcript of his evidence, if I could. It's referenced PHT, about 6 zeros, and then 202. Page 72, lines 6 to 17, please. Yeah, so he was asked, what do you mean that efforts were undermined? Was it a case of governors were ready to bring back face-to-face education? And this is Mr. Taylor's response. The trade union for the education providers had decided to withdraw members from those prisons, but it was also the directive, as we saw often during the pandemic, was that directives were about prisoners generally and the needs of children were an afterthought. Very often, here, and you'll see some of the correspondence from my predecessor, Peter Clark, about that, but the result was that a guillotine was placed on education. Any attempts to reopen education were quickly, and nothing really got going until we were back in the summer, later on in the summer. So do you accept that HMPPS played a role in stopping face-to-face education?
So can I just tell you what I knew? So first of all, I don't agree with Charlie Taylor that the directive was a guillotine. And my reading of the guidance, education was to be considered and provided. So I don't accept that that's what the directive, if he's referring to the guidance, I don't accept that's what it says. Secondly, Charlie Taylor wasn't in post at this time. Peter Clark was in post at this time. And then if I could just go through a couple of incidents which maybe draw out why I believed education was being sought to be provided and potentially was being provided on the estate, and that HMPPS wasn't stopping it. So I can't answer your first question.
You can.
So
Ms. Fraser, sorry, you can, but I think I've got one more piece of evidence on this to put to you.
Okay, so I'll do it.
I'll do that first, and then you can
let me answer your specific question.
Right.
Because the Children's Commissioner, I had a number of conversations with the Children's Commissioner, and I always, when I was concerned by what the Children's Commissioner said to me, I always raised them with Dr. Farah. I had a daily meeting with Dr. Farah, and when any stakeholder raised an issue with me, I raised it with Dr. Farah, usually the next day. So the Children's Commissioner said to me, HMPPS is stopping education. And I said to Dr. Farah in one of my meetings, and there's a note of it, I said, I hear that you're stopping education. It was on the 1st of June. She said, we are not stopping education. The unions are preventing education. So that's what was reported to me.
I see. If I could take you to the Independent Monitoring Board's report from 2019 to 2020. That's the front page of the report. And if we could go to page 16, please. This is another report. It says, at Cookham-Wood, Novus education staff provided remote resources, including individual work packs, newsletters, and prison radio podcasts that were pushed under room doors during lockdown. And within 2 weeks, they had developed a risk-assessed plan for partial return to education, which was supported by local staff, management, and unions. However, it was rejected at higher levels in the prison service by HMPPS Gold Command, though a very similar plan was implemented 4 months later. So this is another report from another independent agency looking at prisons,
Yeah.
which repeats, in essence, the same claim that Mr. Taylor has made.
Sure.
Do you think that they both got it wrong?
Well, let me tell you what I knew at the time. So, first of all, this issue of Novus preparing something in HMPPS rejecting was never raised with me as far as I can recall. Mm-hmm. And I think had it been raised with me, I would have put it to Dr. Farah as I did all other issues. I spoke regularly to all the providers. Every single time I made an announcement, I did 20 calls. This happened about 5 times during the course of the year, and the IMB were one of my stakeholders. I don't recall this particular issue being raised. This report was produced after I left office, so I didn't investigate it because it wasn't in my time. Can I just give you a couple of points which hopefully show you why that is my recollection that the HMPPS were trying to provide education, which are contemporaneous at the time. So first of all, we've already seen Novus, and you've seen the Novus is the provider that you're referring to here.
Yes.
And it was Novus that wrote saying, please stop education.
Yes. Yeah.
And you saw YCS's response to that, which is to push back against Novus, saying, no, you do have to provide something. Mm-hmm. And another interaction I had on education was the POA came to see me and the Lord Chancellor in late April. I think it was the 27th of April. And at that meeting, they complained that education was being provided at Park.
Yes.
And they asked the Lord Chancellor to stop education at Park. So it was clear that the POA did have a view that education would stop, and they were putting up some resistance to it because they personally raised it with me and the Lord Chancellor.
Yes, and the POA, that's the Prison
the Prison Officers Association.
So it's sort of trade union for the prison
It's the trade union and the third thing is, you'll recall from my witness statement that I did virtual visits, and the first virtual visit that I did was I wanted to know what was happening on the ground. Most of my information came from Dr. Farah. I wanted to hear firsthand from people other than the stakeholders. So I asked to visit the prisons virtually because I couldn't go face to face. My first one was on the 13th of May. I asked for it to be the youth estate. There were 3 governors virtually in the meeting, and I asked them all how things were going, and they had an opportunity to share any concerns there with me. One of the institutions said, education will start imminently. So that was the 13th of May, before the guidance had come out. So not only was Dr. Farah telling me they wanted, but there was a problem, institutions were telling me that they were trying to provide it and they had plans to provide it. So they were obviously had read the guidance in the way we had intended it to have been drafted. In the national framework, obviously, we set out specifically that education should be provided. And then the other incident which underlies that it was the POA that were pressing for education not to be provided is on the 30th of December, so a long time later, when we have provided education in the new national framework. Specifically, on the 30th of December, Dr. Farah tells me that the POA say they want to stop education.
Yes.
So it's clear to me that the POA are raising some issues around education. So obviously that's very difficult for HMPPS And that's how I saw the situation at the time.
Well, there could be two different barriers, couldn't there, to education? There could be the Prison Officers Association and at the same time directive from some senior members of HMPPS.
One doesn't exclude
the other.
entirely possible. All I can tell you is what was told to me and what I believed at the time. So if I answer your question from a different perspective, and it's possible. It's possible. I don't know what wasn't told, and I wasn't on the ground. But what I do know, because I spoke to Dr. Farah every single day, is that I understood she shared my views that education should be provided.
Well, assuming that the reports from the Independent Monitoring Board and the Inspectorate of Prisons are accurate, it sounds as though Dr. Farah either didn't know or wasn't telling you the full picture.
You're suggesting and supposing hypothetical things that I don't know.
Well, we have the reports from the Independent Monitoring Board and we have the reports from the Inspectorate.
You've got two bits of evidence, and I have a year's worth of understanding. You might be right. I can only tell you what I heard.
Okay. You mentioned in your witness statement a sensitive relationship with the Prison Officers Association. Did the need to heed those sensitive relationships and their views about the provision of education contribute to the reduced provision of education for children?
I wasn't involved in any of the discussions with I wasn't involved with any of the discussions with the POA. I know it was a sensitive issue, and the HMPPS told me they had to handle it very carefully. I don't know what was discussed.
You told us a moment ago that you were at a meeting where they raised it.
Yeah, they did.
Okay, so you were involved in some discussions then with them.
I was well, we didn't discuss it. They told us at that meeting that they didn't want to provide education, and sort of intimated that the Lord Chancellor, who was leading the meeting, should intervene in order to stop education at Park.
And did he say absolutely not, education must continue for children?
There's a readout, so I don't want to misquote him, but I think he said, I will look into that.
Sorry, you think he said?
I think he said, we'll look into it. I don't remember. Exactly, but I think he said.
I see.
I think he said. I think he said something like, "I'm sure that complies with the social distancing guidelines, but I will look into it."
I see. Is it the responsibility of the Lord Chancellor and also the Minister to manage industrial relations with the prison service?
So yes and no. So I've tried to get over in a number of ways how important it was for the staff to come in every day. And Phil Coppell, who was the Director General of HMPPS, had a very good relationship with the POA. And that was critical to the operation of the estate, including the children's estate. And Dr. Farah told us that that they were having difficult conversations with HMPPS. I don't think it's the minister's job to disrupt that delicate relationship and make matters worse. And therefore, I don't think it would have been if someone had asked me to get involved with that discussion, I would absolutely 100% have done that. Nobody did. And I didn't offer it. Whereas you'll see throughout my statement, I offered assistance on a whole range of other things proactively because I felt that this was a matter that was better resolved by HMPPS.
Mm-hmm. You say that you don't think it's the minister's job to disrupt that delicate relationship. But
at this critical time. We had lots of issues and very difficult conversations with the POA at other times, but we were managing a pandemic.
Yeah, I have to ask you to wait for the question, please. Do you accept that the management of that relationship ought not to have come at the cost of providing essential services to children in prison?
Well, I think that's quite a loaded question, to be honest. Spottle. Don't worry about answering, Ms. Fraser.
Okay, I'll move on now to time outside of the cell. That was one of the impacts of the regime.
Sure.
Okay. In March, the Children's Commissioner had written to the Lord Chancellor and you about her concerns that children would be held in solitary confinement. And in April, the Inspectorate for Prisons carried out a short scrutiny visit of several young offenders institutions, which showed, for example, that all children in Cookham Wood were locked in their cells for more than 23 hours a day. In May, the Children's Commissioner published a public briefing on the issue and noted that for the majority of children in YOIs and secure training centres, they'd been spending between 40 minutes and just over 3 hours out of their cells each day. Do you recall hearing these updates from the Children's Commissioner and the Inspectorate for Prisons?
Yes, where there's records of the Children's Commissioner and the Inspectorate raising things with me, I recall them.
Okay. In the Children Commissioner's update, she says that the Youth Custody Service had introduced a new method for calculating time outside of the cell, and that until August of 2020, there wasn't a reliable calculation for time outside of the cell. And I just wondered if you could help us with why there was a delay for the Ministry of Justice monitoring data about the time outside of the cell.
I think there's quite an extensive paragraph in my witness statement dealing with the time out of cell. But I'll tell you my instincts on that. So I pressed for time out of cell to be recorded because I wanted to hold the institutions to account, given the time out of cell stories, reports that I was hearing. It wasn't something that had been measured beforehand, and I think it took HMPPS some time to work out how to do it consistently across the estate. And if you could just bear in mind, HMPPS is dealing with a pandemic, is collecting a huge amount of data on a whole range of issues. This is a really critical one, which is why it was important we collected it. But that's possibly why it wasn't collected as early as it could have been or should have been.
Okay. Mr. Taylor gave evidence to the inquiry that as late as June of 2025, many young offender institutions are still operating restricted regimes and access to education remains reduced. And he gave examples of restrictions including excessive amounts of time in the cell, far too many children having less than 2 hours out of the cell a day, and very poor access and provision of education and other purposeful activity. I appreciate this is after you left the Ministry of Justice.
Right.
But the difficulties, the lack of provision within the youth estate continued from lockdown until now.
Yeah, I can't answer to any things that go after my time.
Okay. I'm going to ask you now about legislation reducing regime.
Because you've time out of cell I think is really critical, and there's a few things I'd just like to say very briefly about it. So time out of cell was linked to education. You can't take them separately. If kids had got education as we had planned, they would have had more time out of cell. And in my view, the way to fundamentally, as a minister, to fundamentally change the picture was to change the national standards. So that's what I could do as a minister. I couldn't operate each institution, but I could make sure that we had wider allowance, fewer restrictions on the national restrictions when we opened up. I could make sure we prioritised the youth estate for opening up, which I pressed Dr. Farrer to do, which I think we did do, and I could consistently raise with Joe and measure the time out of cell to make sure that that was done. So those are a few of the steps that we took internally.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to move on now to the legislation which reduced the regimes in the Children and Young People's Secure Estate. So we know that the lockdown occurred on the 24th of March quite quickly. And it's right, isn't it, that statutory instruments were introduced later
Yes.
to provide a legal basis for that
Correct.
reduced regime?
Yeah.
Okay. I'd like to focus in particular on the changes in the secure training centre rules,
Sure.
which came into force on the 2nd of July of 2020. The exploratory memorandum to those changes states, for example, that there is a temporary minimum restricted regime for children which reduces their time out of room to at least 1.5 hours out of their room a day. And it would normally be 14 hours, but it was reduced to 1.5 hours out of day. It also reduced access to classroom education. The statutory instrument also permitted the suspension of family visits and certain welfare obligations. It was passed, as I said, in July, came into force in July of 2020, at a time when lockdown in the community was easing. So non-essential retail, for example, had reopened. People were permitted to gather in small groups. At that time, did you feel that it struck an appropriate balance between the rights of children and the measures needed to reduce the transmission of the virus?
So I think you captured the reason why we brought this legislation in your question to me. We needed to make sure that what we were doing was legal. And therefore, we needed to pass the statutory instrument to ensure that what was practically happening on the ground was provided for by a legislative base. Otherwise, we could have been challenged, which wouldn't have been very helpful. So that's what this did. We didn't have time to do it beforehand. I think we had only spotted the STCs. We hadn't done it for STCs at a later date, because obviously we did it for YOIs earlier. That's why we brought in the legislation. And I think if you read paragraph 7.2, if you'd carried on, you'd have said, it is the minimum expected level of delivery during a secure estate alert level broadly comparable with level 4. At all times, SDCs will be required to deliver the highest possible regime while still complying with health guidelines. So all we were doing was setting out a legal basis for what was possible, i.e. very, very minimum regime. But we were not saying this is the minimum standard. We were not saying this is the standard. We were saying this is the minimum we expect, but we actually expect you to go much higher than that. We expect you to deliver the highest possible regime whilst complying with the health guidelines.
But you provided them with the option to lawfully keep children in their rooms.
We were legislating for what was practically happening.
Ms. Fraser, let me ask the question. You were legislating to allow secure training centres to keep children in their rooms for 23 and a half hours a day, which would qualify as solitary confinement.
We were putting together a legal base to ensure that what we did was legal. We were as we do with many policies and laws. We make sure that we have provided a legal base. We were in no way suggesting at this time that this was what we expected of our institutions.
Okay, and just to finish up on this topic before the break, there was no consultation undertaken with the Children's Commissioner prior, no equality impact assessment or child right impact assessment. Is that right?
So I saw just on consultation. So it's possible, yes, and probable. There was no specific consultation prior to with the Children's Commissioner prior to this coming into force. But if I could just put consultation into context, prior to the pandemic, I had no that my former office has found I had no contact with the Children's Commissioner during between the 30th of March and the 9th of July. I met the Children's Commissioner 5 times. So whenever she wanted to speak to me, I met her. Whenever she wrote to me, I met her. Whenever I had something to say to her, I met her. So she had plenty of opportunity, as did many stakeholders, to raise concerns with me. And as we've already identified, the YOI amendments came in before the STC one. So I think in a normal scenario, before you bring in legislation, you consult with a range of people. This was not a normal scenario, but there was plenty of opportunity for people to engage with me throughout this period.
Okay, we can pause there, I think, my lady, for a break.
Certainly. I shall return at 10 past, and I promise you we will finish you this evening.
Thank you.
All right.
Yes. Ms. Fraser, I'd like to move on now to ask you about the urgent notification issued in respect of Rainsbrook Secure Training Centre.
Yeah.
The inquiry has heard evidence from Charlie Taylor about the failings which led to the notification being issued in December of 2020. In October and November of 2020, Her Majesty's Inspector of Prisons carried out assurance visits at Rainsbrook. And the visit in October of 2020 showed that newly admitted children who have to self-isolate are locked in their bedrooms for 14 days and only allowed out for 30 minutes. And the report said that there was no rational reason to support this practice. Were you aware at that stage, after the assurance visit in October, that there were these concerns about Rainsbrook Secure Training Centre?
So looking back at what my recollection of this isn't as strong as some of the other areas that we've covered. But looking back at the notes and the evidence, I was first made aware of this on the 2nd of November, but it was not informing me. It was just shared. It wasn't anything for me to decide or personally act. I was just shared a copy of a briefing note for information that was sent to Dr. Farrer. And then Charlie Taylor raised this with me in a call that I had on the 12th of November.
I see.
And then I suspect I spoke to my private office about it, although I can't recall, because on the 13th of November, my private office told me that the Lord Chancellor was dealing with it.
I see. And so if the Lord Chancellor was dealing with it, do I understand then that you didn't take any further action at that stage?
No, I did take some action, but on some things where the Lord Chancellor was dealing with it, I didn't always take as proactive a stance as I did when I wasn't told that. So I got a briefing note on the 16th of December. I discussed it with Joe on the... So I didn't... It doesn't look like I did much after the 13th of November. And then I think we get the UN on the 16th. At the same time of December, I get a briefing note. I discuss it immediately with Dr. Farrer on the same day, and I ask to speak to the CEO of MTC, David Hood, and I speak to the CEO to raise my concerns about it on the 21st of December.
Okay. In his evidence to the inquiry, Charlie Taylor was asked if he was given an explanation for the failure to heed the October report, because there's the October report and then the December report. And if we can just pull up the transcript, please, to see his evidence. He says, "It was astonishing. It's almost as if no one was really checking. It was very early when I just started at the inspectorate, and we just assumed that going in there and writing the initial report that we'd written, saying that for goodness sake, you know, there are ways of doing this in a more creative, we know it's difficult, but there are ways of doing this more creatively. And it was just really astonishing that monitors, leaders, and the Youth Custody Service, none of these people had picked it up." And what he's referring to here about doing it more creatively is the scheme by which newly arrived children were placed in isolation for 14 days and only allowed out of their cells for 30 minutes. And what I want to explore with you is, can you provide us with any insight as to why the inspectorate's concerns after that visit went unheeded?
What's the period that he's talking about where they've gone unheeded?
He's talking about the October visit. They go,
Yeah.
they notice
Yeah.
the children
Yeah.
are being held
Yeah.
for 14 days, only allowed out of their cells for 30 minutes at a time. And he's asked why no one had picked it up, and he said it was astonishing. And I
So
want
it
to...
didn't come to my attention, as I said, until November. And when he personally raised it with me, the Lord Chancellor said he was dealing with it. I do have a recollection of some conversations that I had with Dr. Farah, but I can't 100% recollect when exactly they were. But I'm very happy to share them with you if you want. And I haven't found any documentary evidence which bears any of what I'm about to say out, but I can tell you what I think I recollect, if that would be helpful.
Please do.
So I think the position was that, so Rainsbrook was a private prison, a private institution, and the way that that's monitored is that there are people from HMPPS who monitor it. And I think Dr. Farah was under the impression that those people had got a little bit too close to... So first of all, Rainsbrook, MTC did not accept, my understanding is that MTC did not accept that there were issues at Rainsbrook. And secondly, the HMPPS people who were meant to be monitoring it were a little bit too close to the management at Rainsbrook. So that's all I recall of possibly why the issues hadn't been resolved earlier.
I see. Well, you became involved, I think you became involved once the urgent notification,
Yeah.
or more heavily involved, if I
Yeah.
can put it that way. And what action did you take once you received the urgent notification?
So remember, the Lord Chancellor is dealing with it. So I asked to speak to the CEO of MTC to find out what was happening. And then a statutory process, once the urgent notification is made, a statutory process kicks in. And what happens is that HMPPS put a number of proposals as to how improvements need to be made. They put that, so I had updates from Dr. Farah as to whether MTC were complying with those requirements. And from memory, my understanding is that they were. And I left in March, and I think things evolved after that as well.
I see. Do you accept that there was a general failure of oversight of HMPPS as regards Rainsbrook Secure Training Centre?
I would just repeat what I said on this particular occasion. I think Dr. Farah thought that HMPPS had got the HMPPS staff hadn't picked up some of the issues, and Rainsbrook wasn't taking responsibility for the errors that it was making.
Mm-hmm. But you and, of course, the Lord Chancellor have that oversight role over HMPPS. So some of the responsibility, of course, lies with you and ultimately the Lord Chancellor.
Yes, and as soon as the urgent notification was issued, a process was followed which ultimately led to MTC losing its contract. You have to remember that it's a contract, so we can't just step in and immediately take over. You know, there are consequences of shutting down an institution, or there are legal consequences of taking away a contract. So we had to go through some procedures in order to make sure that we gave MTC the chance to prove that it could operate the institution. And as it transpired, it didn't come up to those standards that we required of it. But I wasn't involved. I left the office the following March, early March, I think the 2nd.
At the beginning of your evidence, you accepted that the youth estate wasn't functioning as it should, and that was one of the reasons why, as I understand it, you were exploring in your time in office moving to a system of secure schools, for example. Did the urgent notification being triggered at Rainsbrook, did that help inform your thinking?
No, I believe
estate?
the secure schools are the way forward in order to rehabilitate young people who've committed crimes. And that's why I was pursuing policy of secure schools.
Did you draw any conclusions or any lessons from the urgent notification which was issued at Rainsbrook?
What do you mean by lessons?
Well, any lessons to be learned for future management of the secure estate?
I'm afraid I don't have all the details to hand of what they. Obviously, they weren't operating as they should, particularly in relation to how I think they received people in during the pandemic. Obviously, that was wrong and it wasn't happening at different institutions. And I hope that I'm sure HMPPS took those matters on board in relation to making sure other institutions were operating fully and appropriately.
Did you draw from that experience that there was also not just a failure within Rainsbrook and the company that operated it, but a failure of oversight from HMPPS?
I don't have any more to add to what I've already said.
Okay. I'm going to ask you now about the early release provisions, which were brought into force at an early stage in the pandemic to reduce the prison population. I think you deal with it at paragraph 130 of your witness statement, the reasons for the scheme. If we could just bring that up, please. Paragraph. Yes, page 32, paragraph 130.
Just coming back to Rainsbrook, because I'm just reflecting on what you've said. I think the problem lay with MTC. I don't think you can say it was all HMPPS's fault. The problem lay with them. But of course, HMPPS had a duty also to oversight. Just wanted to add that.
Yes, I think we've...
It wasn't a public institution.
Yes, I think we can agree on that. It's not that there's no fault with MTC, but that HMPPS also has a role to play in oversight.
Of course.
Okay. So moving on now to the early release scheme. So in your statement, you deal with the scheme. You say the key reasons for early release were to reduce the population in order to allow single cell occupancy for isolation and to release clinically vulnerable prisoners. We all recognize the need for decisions on release to be based on scientific evidence. In a note from the Lord Chancellor's private office following a meeting on the 21st of March, which I and the Lord Chancellor attended, it is recorded that the Lord Chancellor asked for work to start identifying the vulnerable cohorts and the practical steps we would need to release them. We also wanted a clear scientific rationale for who we would be releasing. We've already seen the evidence, the briefing, from PHE, from Dr. O'Moore, setting out the need for to reduce overcrowding in the estate and to have single cell occupancy to reduce the risks of infection in prisons. And we can take that down now. In the end, it's right, isn't it, that no children were released under the early release provisions?
That's correct.
But adults were released?
Some adults were released.
Some, yes, not all, but some adults were released?
Yeah.
Okay. And would you agree with me that the reason that children weren't released, they had the same eligibility criteria as the adults. But in the end, children weren't released because, of course, they were held in single cell accommodation anyway. There was sufficient headroom within the youth custody estate to absorb any additional demand on bed spaces. And there weren't many children who were clinically vulnerable. So the real goals for the early release scheme didn't apply to children in the same way as they applied to adults. Would you
Those
agree
were
with that?
definitely factors, but if I could outline why I think no children were released in a bit more detail. So first of all, we only released people who hadn't committed serious offences. And as you quite rightly stated, we had under 800 young people in the estate. Some of those, therefore, you only go to prison if you're a young person if you've committed a very serious offence or you're a persistent offender. So there was a reason why those people were in the institution, and therefore there's a reason why they probably weren't eligible under the scheme. The second reason is, and this is a really important reason, and I'm not sure it comes out sufficiently, is that as ministers we had a duty to protect the public. And we'd be having a very different inquiry right now if we had released someone, and child or adult, and they had gone on to commit a serious crime. And I was responsible for probation as well as for prisons. And during my time as the Minister for Probation, the Parole Board had released somebody and they had gone on to commit a very serious crime. And there was an inquiry and an investigation as to why we had allowed that person, why the Parole Board had allowed that person to be released. So releasing someone when you're a minister has a number of issues you have to consider, and protecting the public is a significant one. And the other one that you haven't mentioned that's relevant is where, in order to release a child, particularly a child, you have to make sure that they're going to be protected when they go into the community. And if you think about, I'm sure you've heard evidence of the state of education, the state of social care, the state of looked after children during the course of this inquiry. And we were very conscious that we would be releasing people potentially to places where they would have no education, that have no healthcare, that have no mental health support, and they possibly wouldn't have the appropriate home in the community. So it's not just it's great to release people because then they're free. You've got to think about also what is the scenario in which they then face.
So you would agree that the extent to which children were released was hampered by a lack of availability and capacity to find them suitable homes in the community?
That was one factor.
So it's one factor, and actually you don't get to that question. That question is later on. So the first question is, what's the level of offence and protection of the public? And then there's, do we actually need to release people? You remember, there was a lot of pushback from Number 10 not to release anybody at all. I pushed very hard to persuade the Prime Minister to allow us to release people in the interest of public health. That's why we were releasing people. We were releasing people in the interest of public health, not because it was difficult in prisons, but because they might contract coronavirus. And as you rightly said, Ms. Pottle, there wasn't that issue in the youth estate. A, children were less affected by the virus, and B, they had single cells anyway. Yes. So there wasn't the impetus to release people, but there was the scheme available. And then we got on to, well, if they've satisfied all the criteria, is it appropriate to release them? And then we look at that next factor, which is where will they go? Is there a place to go?
Yes, I see. The Children's Commissioner had written to you on the 25th of March calling for the release of children in order to protect their rights during the pandemic.
Sure.
So not as a sort of infection control measure,
but
in order to ensure that they weren't adversely affected by drops in staffing levels, for example, or no visits, or a drop in their time out of their rooms. And all of those things, of course, came to pass. But the reason, I suppose, that no children were released is that the criteria were designed, and they're the same eligibility criteria for children as adults, and they were designed to release offenders who wouldn't pose a risk to the public, and they were designed to avoid, deaths in custody, which was really more of a problem for adults than for children.
Yeah, I set out
right?
the criteria why we considered them, and I think they were the appropriate criteria.
You don't think that it was appropriate to have different criteria for children?
Well, we did.
If I can just ask
have different.
Pardon me.
We had
Can
the same.
I just need to ask the question.
Of course.
Okay. You didn't think that it was appropriate to have different criteria for children so that they could be released in order to protect them from the poor regime in the children's secure estate?
So you'll see if you look through the subs that during the course of discussing this, the Lord Chancellor specifically said, I think we should consider children separately. There's a sub where the HMPPS say we are looking at children separately. So we did think about, should there be a different regime for children? And we concluded, I think HMPPS advised us in the interest of public protection. But anyway, the advice was that we shouldn't have a separate regime. But that's not to say we didn't consider it. I'd really like to get over, because I know a lot of people have given evidence about and disappointed with the outcomes of the decisions that we might have made. But I would really like to get over that I cared deeply about young people, the Lord Chancellor cared deeply about young people, and Dr. Farah cared deeply about young people, and we were all on the same page about the importance of young people. And at every single stage in the course of our considerations and decisions, we considered young people. Now, people might not be happy with the outcome the decision that we actually came to, because in the end it ended up being the same as adults. But that's not to say we didn't consider it at the outset. So
Okay.
the Lord Chancellor had specifically said, can we consider whether we have a different position for young people? And in the end, we didn't.
I'd like to pull up, please.
But for the fact that each person was considered on a case-by-case basis.
Okay. I'd like to pull up, please, a document which was a briefing given to you as the scheme progressed and it became clear that no children were being released. And the document is INQ 000567552. So this is from Colin Allers from the Youth Justice Board to you. And he's providing a briefing on the impact of COVID on the youth justice sector. And if we can scroll, please, to page 3. It's a secure estate, and he gives an update as to, thank you, difficulties in the secure estate. And the bottom paragraph, he says, although the numbers of children in the secure estate has been reducing, the Youth Justice Board has been working to support the Ministry of Justice and the Youth Custody Service to further reduce the numbers in custody. We have worked with the Youth Custody Service to advise on the arrangements for the emergency temporary release by providing specific support and guidance on ensuring the safety and suitability of children's release arrangements. We've also worked to resolve issues around communication with a child on release and transportation. You will know that there are currently 9 children in scope for release in the next 100 days. It is disappointing that more children are not in scope for release and that no children have been released to date. If we turn over the page, he says, we would recommend reviewing the criteria being applied to children under the scheme to develop a set of criteria, particularly for children, rather than overlaying the criteria for adults. So you were being advised by your officials that no children were being released, you were aware of that, and that you should consider developing specific criteria for children. And a decision was taken, I presume, not to do that.
So the YJB, you describe Colin Allers and the YJB as an official. HMPPS are the main agency responsible for the youth custody estate. And we took advice from them, and I have said we did think about whether there should be a specific regime. We'd already considered whether there should be the same criteria for young children. For a variety of reasons, we decided that there shouldn't be. I did press HMPPS on a number of occasions as to why more people were not coming through the system. I was really disappointed because I'd expended political capital on getting this regime through Number 10. And we'd really said we need to release people. We'd impressed on them that we needed to do in order to manage the estate properly. And very few numbers were coming through. So on a number of occasions, I said to Dr. Farrer, and I think I said at one stage, this scheme is too leisurely, being operated too leisurely. So I was pressing for people who were within the criteria to come through, and no one came to me. My office, in preparing for this, did look at why. I keep saying my office. Of course, they're not my office. The officials have looked at why the individuals who did satisfy the criteria, why they did not come through, and there were individual reasons for each one, like they were being released anyway on different types of scheme because their time was up, or
Yes.
they weren't suitable for various high-risk reasons.
Yeah. In your witness statement, you say, on reflection, a custodial sentence is a matter of last resort, and so the seriousness of the offence might have excluded them from release. But that is a matter which could have been appreciated at the time that the eligibility criteria were being drawn up.
That's what we did consider it at the time, and that's
Yes.
why there were so few children within scope.
And so the priority was not to release children in order to improve their conditions in custody.
No, the priority was to release people in order to free up space. The advice we'd been given the reason we were doing this was because Dr. O'Moore had advised that in order to operate the prison system, for health reasons, we needed to release significant numbers of people.
Ms. Fraser, one final question from me. Taking a step back from all the issues that we've covered this afternoon, the use of the same criteria for adults and children in the early release provisions, applying the same operational guidance on social distancing to children in custody, for example, would you agree that, being 1% of the prison population, children's specific needs and vulnerabilities were not given sufficient consideration by you during the pandemic?
No, I would not agree with that. At each stage, when we made a decision, we thought about the particular cohorts within our estate very carefully, because we all cared about children. And we thought about them. We didn't always make a differential decision, but we certainly considered it.
Thank you very much. I have no further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Potter. Ms. Gigi, she's over there.
Ms. Fraser, I'm asking questions on behalf of children's rights organisations. I want to ask how the MOJ monitored the impact of restrictions on children in custody during the pandemic when independent oversight was suspended in March 2020. In your statement at paragraph 263, you note that the MOJ received data on time out of cells, and you told us today in your evidence that it was a really critical measure. In July 2020, the data showed the lowest midweek average per day was YOI Cookham Wood with 2.3 hours, and the highest was Rainsbrook with an average of 6.5 hours out of room across June. However, as we've heard, Ofsted found during their independent monitoring visit to Rainsbrook in October 2020 that children were still being locked in their cells for 23.5 hours a day, prompting an urgent notification in December 2020. This was akin to solitary confinement and is very different from the 6.5 hours out of cell time that was reported to you in June. Did you raise concerns with anyone, for example with Ofsted, that while some oversight was maintained of young offenders institutes in the form of short scrutiny visits, there was no oversight of secure training centres at all for 6 months? And in the absence of that independent oversight, did you take any steps to ensure the information you received was accurate, for example, by speaking to children directly?
Thank you very much for your question on a very important subject about monitoring. I encouraged any monitoring. I was keen to have any information come my way so that I could fulfill my job as effectively as possible as Prisons Minister. So if any of the institutions who were responsible for monitoring prisons wanted to continue to monitor their prisons, I encouraged and supported it. So, for example, Her Majesty's Prisons Inspectorate asked to continue to monitor. HMPPS were a little bit nervous about that, considering the burden that it placed on them, but I said that it needed to continue to take place. The IMB continued to monitor prisons. The Children's Commissioner asked for evidence. When she asked for evidence, I made it available to her. I tried to speak to people on the ground. So as I've mentioned during the course of my evidence, I spoke to the prison governors of the youth estate and indeed governors of other prisons as well. And I tried to collect data as well and try to encourage HMPPS to collect data. So we've heard
Ms.
about...
Fraser, I'm sorry for interrupting,
Sure.
But specifically on secure training centres,
Yes.
You were aware that there was no independent oversight of those for almost 6 months. Did you take any steps to ensure that the information you were receiving on such an important measure that you recognise yourself was correct?
So it's for the institutions to decide, because they have the duty of care to their staff, how they were going to manage the pandemic. If Ofsted had said to me they wanted to continue to go into institutions, I would have been in favour of it. I did meet the Amanda Spielman of Ofsted to discuss their inspection of the institutions.
Turning now, please, Ms. Fraser, to considering all the restrictions on children in custody, including lack of
Can
meaningful
you close to
access.
the microphones? I can't, it's probably my age and hearing, but
Apologies, my lady.
Thank you.
Turning now to considering all restrictions on children in custody, including having no meaningful access to education and stopping of visits. How frequently was the impact and proportionality of placing children under such severe restrictions reviewed? And what steps were taken to ensure children were treated in a way that recognised their distinct needs and vulnerabilities?
So each institution could, the framework that we set out allowed for discretion for each institution to manage the pandemic in the way that it saw fit. And so they had the discretion to change what they were doing in accordance to what they thought ought to be happening on the ground. We also had the level, we had a framework which set out a number of levels, and if an institution felt that it could go to the next level and decrease restrictions, there was a gold command procedure to enable it to do that. And so there was provision to enable people to adapt as circumstances changed.
thank you very much, Patricia.
Thank you, my lady.
Mr. Gardner, I've given you permission for a question, but looking at it, I'm not quite sure where it's going, but see if you can make it clear to me, see if Ms. Fraser can understand.
I'm very grateful, my lady. Ms. Fraser, I represent the Children's Commissioner for Wales. You'll be aware that in Wales, youth justice policy is not a devolved matter, but public health is a devolved matter. Now, this inquiry has heard evidence from Charlie Taylor already that suggests that during the pandemic, YOI Park, for example, managed to work effectively with Public Health Wales and produced, in his view, a much better situation than the YOIs in England. Now, conversely, the Children's Commissioner for Wales has had to work with Hillside Secure Children's Home to deal with problems that she experienced, including a difficulty in understanding the guidance that they should follow, in struggling to obtain testing kits because of a lack of clarity over which body should be providing them, and in practices of lengthy isolation periods. Now, with that varied background, may I ask for your views on how public health guidance coming from Welsh institutions, but prison policy coming from the UK government, had an impact on both the formulation of MOJ policy and your views on the wider impact on children and young persons in the secure estate in Wales?
I think it's difficult to extrapolate from two particular institutions the entirety of policy. And a secure children's home were not my responsibility. So it's difficult for me to comment on the question you raise. I mean, just in relation to Park, I saw what Charlie Taylor said about it, and this is only speculation on my part, but I do think that Park operated well before the pandemic and therefore operated well during the pandemic, and indeed after the pandemic. I went to see it. It's a very good institution. And in addition, because it's a private institution, it was managed, its education providers were both its staff and its education providers, both provided by G4S. And I think that was why it did so well. And I think it also probably underlines that it wasn't the guidance. They didn't have the same problems with the unions.
Yes. If I just may very briefly follow up, my lady, but very brief.
Better be brief.
Of course, I'm very grateful, my lady. In which case, that's operational, and I understand the difference there. In terms of the formulation of policy, so you had a lot of consultation with Public Health England. Did Public Health Wales ever become involved?
Well, as you say, health was a devolved matter. And I'm sure that Eamon O'More liaised with, well, I'm not sure, I hope Eamon O'More liaised with Public Health Wales. He was my main contact.
I'm grateful, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Gardner. Ms. Pottle, I think that completes the questions.
Yes.
Ms. Fraser.
My-
Thank you. Sorry. Anything more for this witness? No, thank you. Thank you very much indeed for your help, Ms. Fraser. That completes all the questions
Thank you
we have for
very
you.
much.
I'm
Thank
tempted to ask whether life in private sector is better or worse than the public, but I won't do that. And thank you for your help.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all your time on this very important issue. Thank you.
Yes.
My lady, that concludes the oral evidence for week 3 of Module 8.
With your permission, we will also adduce into evidence a number of witness statements relevant to the evidence you've heard this week on education, social care, health and youth justice. These include statements from UK government departments, inspectorates and qualifications bodies, public health organisations, as well as a number of charities and non-governmental organisations. These will shortly be published on the inquiry's website. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms. Bottom. And that includes the statement from Eamon O'Moore, about whom Ms. Fraser's been speaking. Thank you very much. I shall sit again at 10:30 on Monday, the 20th of October. Thank you.